Good afternoon, welcome. We'd like to thank you for coming to this in conversation on racial disparities in the criminal justice system. It's great to have you here in person, and for those of you who are joining us online. My name is Reese Hester. I'm a research fellow here at the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. I do research in the area of criminal sentencing and racial disparities, and so I'm really happy to be here and to serve as the moderator for this wonderful panel of four people who I'll introduce shortly. Before I get to the introductions of our panelists, I have a couple of quick announcements. If you are an attorney and you're interested in CLE credits, we have applied for an elimination of bias for 2 hours of elimination of bias. That's pending. I do have the event numbers if you'd like to take them down. If you're here in person or you're watching this live right now on the simulcast, there's a 6-digit number. And for those of you who will be watching this later on demand, I have a different number. So if you're here now or you're watching live, the 6-digit number is 222036. 222036. And if you're watching this at a later date, it's 222037. Okay, you can find information on that at our website, robinainstitute.org. We are videotaping this conversation today, and so eventually that will also be on our website, and you can watch it again or refer friends to it if you're interested. The format for today will be the four speakers. They'll each talk for about 15 minutes, and I'll introduce them shortly. Then we'll come up together for the second hour and sit at these chairs and continue the conversation. An extensive part of that will be audience questions and participation. So we'll look forward to getting you involved in the conversation at that time. Now, racial disparities in the criminal justice system. The issue is one that's on our radar, I believe. Here in Minnesota, blacks make up just about 5% of the general population, but 31% of the prison population. It's not just Minnesota, and it's not just African Americans. Nationwide, African Americans and Latinos make up about 30% of the general population, but over 50% of the prison population. And for Native Americans, for example, in Minnesota, they make up about 1% of the general population, but about 8% of the prison population. And so it's an issue at the end stage of prison. It raises lots of questions, the issues of racial disparities that we'll be unpacking today. A few that come to mind are, is this evidence of discrimination in the criminal justice system? And what are the sources of disparity? Is it because of policing or because of prosecutorial decision making? Is it because of judges? Is it because of the way we have our laws written? Is the criminal justice system, at least in part, to blame for racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system? Does it predate involvement in the criminal justice system? So you have all these issues with social and economic disadvantage and involvement in crime. We'll hear today from our panelists how they deal with these issues, and then get your take on it. I'll introduce all four of our panelists right now, and then they'll just come up one after the other to give their presentations. First, we'll be hearing from Professor Richard Fraze of the University of Minnesota Law School, who is also co-director with Kevin Reitz of the Robina Institute. Professor Fraze is a nationally recognized expert on sentencing and sentencing guidelines. He's written 8 books and over 70 articles on these and related issues. If any of you are lawyers who went to the University of Minnesota for law school, there's a good chance that Professor Fraze taught you about mens rea, probable cause, the exclusionary rule, and maybe even a little bit about disparities in the criminal justice system. There are a lot of people who deserve credit for the Robina Institute, for the research that we do, our publications, and the events that we sponsor. Nobody deserves any more credit than Professor Fraze for this wonderful institute. I'm happy to consider him a mentor and to be able to work with him, and we look forward to hearing what he has to say. After that, we'll hear from Professor Perry Moriarty, who's a clinical professor here at the law school. In addition to directing students as they learn to handle cases in criminal law and in juvenile justice, she teaches criminal law and race in the law. We pride ourselves here at the law school on being a national leader in clinical experiences for law students. And Professor Moriarty is the co-director of the Child Advocacy and Juvenile Justice Clinic, and she's a shining example of our excellence in this area. She recently won an Oscar for being the best clinical professor in the country. It wasn't really an Oscar, but I didn't know if you all would know what the Association of American Law Schools section on clinical legal education Shannara Gilbert Award was. If you don't know, it's kind of like an Oscar for being the best clinical professor in the country. So Professor Moriarty, we look forward to hearing you this great opportunity from someone who's an academic but also is in the trenches on a daily basis, meeting with clients and handling cases. Third, we have Professor Myron Orfield, who, in addition to being professor of law, is the director of the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity here at the University of Minnesota Law School. Professor Orfield has been a litigator in large law firms, a civil rights lawyer, an assistant attorney general in Minnesota, and many other things. He's published extensively on local government law, spatial inequality, fair housing, school desegregation, charter schools, state and local taxation, and finance and land use laws. The syndicated columnist Neil Pierce called him the most influential demographer in America's burgeoning regional movement. And his research has been used for reforms at the federal and state levels throughout the country. If you don't know of the Metropolitan Institute, after you see Professor Orfield's amazing slides and maps today, I'm sure you'll want to check out their website and find out more about the good work that he's doing through his institute. And finally, we're delighted to have Kedar Hickman. Mr. Hickman is the program manager at Ujamaa Place, where he works with formerly incarcerated individuals and helps with their reentry into society. He, for 22 years, has worked in the public and private sectors, doing this sort of work involved in education, youth, human, community, and economic development. And during that time, he's developed expertise in working with people to help them realize their growth potential through education, self-empowerment, leadership, citizenship, and skills building. He's taught education levels ranging from primary to adult and has worked with community businesses and organizations to better serve the communities in which they're located. Mr. Hickman, thank you for being with us today, and I know we all look forward to hearing from you. I'll turn it over to Professor Fraze, and then we'll join you shortly.
Okay, again, welcome. Thank you for coming to this event. I'm going to sort of set the stage by going through sort of an overview of the major issues that we're going to be addressing, or at least what I see as the major issues, and we'll go from there. I guess the starting point is sort of define our terms. There's disparity is somewhat of a charged term. Most people would say if you have disparity, that's bad. You can also define it more, and that is often bad, but you can define it more broadly as well. And as a starting point, I suggest we define it as what's sometimes called disproportionality. Are there more people of a certain racial or ethnic group at a particular stage of criminal justice than you would expect given their numbers in the general population? Are they overrepresented in prison, in convictions at various stages of criminal justice processing, at arrests? So anyway, let's and a lot of the research sort of takes that as a starting point. You've probably seen data on per capita prison rates for different races, and then the ratio that says that nationally the black prison rate is 6 times the white rate, so that's a disproportionality measure. So anyway, we need to unpack those kinds of measures, and I suggest 3 topics. Of course, we have to find out where they are and what kinds of mechanisms seem to be causing disparities at each of the stages of the process. Then we have to evaluate those sources and think, well, what do we think about them? Clearly, bias is bad, but it turns out a lot of the disparity, a lot of the disproportionality is caused by various kinds of disparate impact, and we have to evaluate just what we think of those impacts and whether they can be reduced and must be reduced. How do we reduce them? So that's the third question of reducing racial disparities, and we can. A lot of jurisdictions around the country have been addressing these issues, so we can get ideas there. We can also brainstorm and think of other ideas, I'm sure. Step number one, where are they? At what stages of criminal justice processing? The answer is all of them. At the earliest stages of the process, when people are investigated by the police, sort of their one entry point into criminal justice, or when they're arrested, that already reflects a combination of behavior and police decisions. For example, where do the police go? Where do they put most of their officers? They're going to find more people to arrest or to investigate wherever they go. And then from there, just following out through the criminal justice system, pretrial detention, who gets locked up more often awaiting trial? People who can't afford bail, or who don't have a job, or don't have other indicia of stability. That has a disparate impact. Prosecutor screening, charging and plea bargaining is often interacting with pretrial detention. It's easier to get a plea out of somebody who wants to get out of pretrial detention right away. Effectiveness of the defense. What kind of resources does the defense have to push back and maintain a balance in the adversary system? And how does that interact with poverty and race and ethnicity? Criminal law, sentencing laws, sentencing guidelines, they're all designed to be race neutral, but in fact they have all kinds of disparate impacts on non-white offenders. And one of the issues that we've looked at a lot at the Robina Institute is the particular impact of sentencing enhancements based on the offender's prior conviction record. And although everybody says, well, that's a relevant factor, it turns out it affects not just sentencing, but all of these decisions: pretrial detention, prosecutor screening, and plea bargaining. The longer your criminal history, the worse the system is going to come down on you, and that has a disparate impact on non-white offenders for various reasons. Sentencing decisions, especially under guidelines, departures from the recommended guideline sentence. It's another place where bias and disproportionality can creep in. And after sentencing, are we going to modify the sentence, in particular revoke probation or post-prison release? And finally, there are all kinds of practices both within and outside the criminal justice system that have disparate impacts and actually often increase the risk of future criminality by increasing the disadvantage of a group of people who, at least for common crimes, are already disproportionately disadvantaged in terms of their socioeconomic status. And so back to step one, it's a vicious circle, a revolving door. We see some of the same people coming in disadvantaged, not getting any better in the criminal justice system, going out with further burdens and disadvantages, coming back in the system at the front again. So we need to interrupt that cycle in various ways. So anyway, quickly to look at some data on what we know about where the disparities arise. Do they get worse as we go through the criminal justice system? In many systems in the country, they do. It turns out Minnesota has some of the worst criminal justice disparities by race. And I'm going to be focusing, for convenience, on disparities between non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. African Americans are the largest non-white group in Minnesota, but there are also serious, in some cases worse, disparities involving Native Americans in Minnesota. But anyway, looking at the data we have for Minnesota. And I put in here not just a measure of criminal justice starting with arrest, but why is it we have serious disparities at arrest? What is that reflecting? Why are those disparities worse in Minnesota, considerably worse, than they are for the country as a whole? So if you look at this chart, this is a study I did a few years ago, and it's, I think, the most comprehensive study that's been done of disparity at different stages of criminal justice and in the community preceding entry into the criminal justice system. Minnesota, this figure 6.2, that means that the family poverty rate when this data was done for African Americans was over 6 times higher than the white poverty rate in Minnesota, compared to 3.4 times higher for all states. So that's right there. We've got a problem out in the community, and it's going to have impact on the criminal justice system. And by the way, that data has gotten worse since this was from 2000. The most recent data, I think it was 2014, instead of it being a Minnesota rate that's 1.8 times worse than the national rate, 6.2 versus 3.4, it's now 2.6 times higher than the national rate. So it's a lot of disparity in socioeconomic measures in Minnesota, worse than nationally. And that carries over into the criminal justice system. Now, arrest rates reflect both behavior, which in turn often reflects disadvantage, but also reflects decisions by the police, particularly for the enforcement of drug crimes. But there are disparities in arrest rates for every type of crime, not just drug crimes. Now, an interesting thing about this study in Minnesota was it showed that from the second line, the stage of arrest to the stage of conviction, there was a rough correspondence. Now, those numbers are not exactly comparable, but they give you a ballpark idea that we're not seeing an overall increase in racial disparity from the stage of arrest to the stage of felony conviction. But then the next line, from 8.8 to 12.1, a big bump up, about 40% jump in racial disparity to the stage of sentencing people to prison. African Americans 12 times more likely on a per capita basis to be sentenced to prison than whites, and then a sort of stability at the end. Now, the data for later years within the criminal justice system, arrest, conviction, prison sentencing, prison populations, that's actually gotten a little better since these years, in spite of the worsening socioeconomic measures. But it's still, I think, for the most recent year, the year-end population ratio was, I think, 9 or 10 to 1, so it's not quite as high as it was, but it's still pretty high. Well, let's take a look at that jump in the middle there, from 8.8 to 12.1. Why is there a jump up in racial disparity between the point of conviction, felony conviction, and felony sentences? Well, it turns out that's not unique to Minnesota. We've been studying other similar guideline systems around the country for which we have data and which are comparable because they have roughly similar sentencing systems. So we have Kansas, North Carolina, Washington State in this chart. And if you compare column 1 to column 3, that's basically, again, the comparison between felony conviction stage and prison sentencing stage. And you see, on average, an increase. So it goes from an average of these 4 jurisdictions of 4.8 to 6.6, which, again, is an increase of about 40%. But the second column there is the important one there. The recommended sentence, that's where the big jump up occurs. And then there's not much change between recommended sentences and imposed sentences. Well, why is it that disparity in the recommended sentences is so much greater than the disparity at the point of conviction? Well, you have to look at what determines a recommended sentence in these systems. And it's basically the nature and severity of the conviction offense combined with the defender's prior criminal record. And prior criminal record in all these systems has a very major impact on the recommended sentence. And so it turns out that because in all of these systems, African Americans on average have more substantial prior records, that translates into higher, more frequent recommended prison sentences. And again, the recommended sentence also depends on the severity of the offense. But the racial differences by severity of the conviction offense are not very great. They're actually much smaller than the differences in criminal history. So I think it calls our attention to a particularly powerful driver of racial disparity, and causes us should cause us to ask, why are we doing those enhancements? Do they need to be as big? Does the formula have to be written the way it is? So that's one of the things we're looking at the Institute. Now, in terms of the kinds of bias, by the way, I should have mentioned, all of these slides either are or soon will be on our website, robinainstitute.org, because there's going to be some things you might want to follow up in the footnotes here, or just get back into what was in that prior slide. So they're there now, or they will be there. And so the Sentencing Project Black Lives Matter report last year identified a number of sources of disparity at different stages of the criminal justice system, and each of them breaks down into different subcategories. Notice there are several kinds of disparate impact. There's also several kinds of bias. So we know, well, animosity, just hating people of a different race or ethnicity, it hasn't gone away. Sometimes that bias is overt. More often, it's implicit, stereotyping, not even necessarily realizing that you are making a biased decision. Disparate impact. Some examples of the effects of laws. I already mentioned criminal history as a strong disparate impact. Some risk assessment tools have factors in them that strongly increase the predicted risk of some offenders, of non-white offenders. That we all, I think many of us are familiar with the famous problem of punishing crack cocaine much more severely than powdered cocaine, and that translating into racial disparity. Disparate impact of resource allocations, in particular for criminal defense, but also in some other areas. Disparate impact of collateral consequences, the effect of a conviction, and especially of a prison sentence, on whether you're eligible for certain jobs, where you can live. Those kinds of things have a strong disparate impact on non-white offenders, and again, the cycle continues. It is a crime-causing effect. Well, topic 2. Where's my? Oh, okay. 2 minutes. Here we go. So we have to look at the different sources of disparity. Obviously, bias has to be eliminated. There's nothing to be said in favor of bias. But disparate impact is a little more complex, because sometimes we can't avoid having a disparate impact. But sometimes we can. And I suggest 3 kinds of ways in which disparate impact is bad and has to be reduced or eliminated. It could be completely unnecessary. For example, we've got an element in a risk assessment tool that increases disparity and disparate impact, doesn't add any predictive value. Get rid of that element. It's not doing anything for you. It's just causing disparity. Similarly, sometimes the law or the punishment is overbroad. So I give the example of drug-free school zones, which have a strong disparate impact, especially the broader versions of those laws, because where do people live? People of color are more likely to live in urban areas and close to a school, so they get caught up in that. And if those laws are broader than they need to be, then we're not getting a benefit that's commensurate with the disparate impact we're causing. Finally, just some disparate impact is wrong in principle and has to be rejected. Racial profiling is wrong, regardless of whether it gives us more, it helps us find more drugs. So that's my position anyway. Topic 3, what do we do about it? What have other jurisdictions done? And I'm not going to have time to go through this line by line, but there's a couple of pages of ideas that other jurisdictions around the country have used. There's a couple of sources at the bottom of the second page, a couple of reports that show what jurisdictions around the country have done. And in some cases, the second report here, the Bureau of Justice Statistics report, which studied, I think it was Georgia, Connecticut, and North Carolina, and found that they were able to lower prison populations and reduce prison disparity basically by eliminating things that were adding to disparity and weren't really doing anything we want done. So there are lots of ways to chip away at various stages of the process to reduce or eliminate forms of disparate impact. And so number one, most important thing on the list there is that we have to know whenever we make a rule or a policy, what is its impact going to be on racial and ethnic minorities? Because if we had done that more systematically with some of our drug laws, and particularly crack powder, we would have at least had to confront this has a huge disparate impact. Do we really want that? Can we justify that? Think again. Maybe we don't need that penalty difference. So anyway, lots of other things have disparate impacts, and different jurisdictions have found ways to cut back or eliminate those impacts. What else can be done? Well, sort of systematically, you have to look at at each step of the process and see how much disparity do we have there. Is it increasing? What's causing it at that step? And then take appropriate measures. So again, my favorite example, a criminal history or prior record enhancements. If we find, as we always will, I think, that they have a disparate impact, maybe we should limit the power of that one sentencing factor, or at least eliminate or put a cap on the magnitude of factors that really don't necessarily reflect behavior. They reflect policing. They reflect where the police go and how many buys they make from somebody before they finally bust them. So there are things we can do at each of these stages. I suggest, we might want to consider a disadvantage mitigating factor. Not to say that people who commit crimes aren't making culpable decisions for which they have to be held accountable, but it's a lot easier for somebody like me to obey the criminal law than it is for somebody suffering from multiple forms of disadvantage. And above all, of course, we don't want to have the criminal justice system make the problems worse. So we want to at least target the people who are most likely to come out worse and then recycle through the system again, give them priority access, and those will be, in many jurisdictions, disproportionately non-white offenders, who are also, if they are higher risk, all the more reason to prioritize improvement, ameliorative services for those offenders. So anyway, just to recap, it's everywhere, all of those stages. Pick your stage or pick several if you want. There's something to work on at each stage, and different sources, modes of disparity at each stage. I do think there's a lot we can learn from what other jurisdictions have done, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So we need to do some creative thinking and try new ideas. But there's no shortage of things to attack, and no shortage of good ideas that have been used around the country. So anyway, that's the overview. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for letting me talk with you this afternoon. I look around this room, and there are so many people in here who have been working on this issue and related issues for a really long time. And a number of you know more about specific aspects of what I'll be talking about than I do. And I'm looking at Judge Warnick here right now, who's on the Sentencing Commission. I'm looking at Dana Swayze, who is, a brilliant statistician. I'm looking at John Stewart, who I think knows everything. And at some point, I hope the universe of wisdom in the audience will be brought to bear, because there are a lot of people out there who are very committed to systemic reform and care an awful lot about these issues. I'm going to really focus on Minnesota. Professor Fraze began to do that, and talk a little bit about where Minnesota stands relative to other states. And then I'll talk a bit more about potential causes of disparities in Minnesota and solutions. What overwhelms me, and I should say I'm not a native Minnesotan, I've been here 8 years, but I come from a state that suffers from a similar problem. And that is that in Minnesota, whites, Euro-Americans, are doing quite well relative to the rest of the country in most measures of social welfare and social control. This is a good place to be statistically if you are Euro-American. It is a much more difficult place to be if you are an individual of color, and more specifically, if you are African American or Native American. The focus of this presentation is criminal justice and not measures of social well-being, but a couple slides, and I imagine Professor Myron Orfield will get into this as well. But the reality is, relative to their counterparts across the country, Minnesotans of color are faring worse in a number of critical measures of social well-being. Families in poverty, for example, there are really significant disparities. Again, Native Americans and African American families are living in poverty at multiple times the rate of white families. There are equivalent disparities in home ownership, in mortality rates, in almost any measure of social well-being that you can touch upon. And I emphasize this not to suggest, and I'll talk about this in a minute, and here we have household income, not to suggest that this should be a conversation entirely about socioeconomic or cultural disadvantage, because I think there are many other things at play when we talk about racial disparities in the criminal justice system. But I say this because if we are wondering whether this issue is finite and whether this issue is urgent, it's really urgent. And it's urgent for a whole bunch of different reasons beyond simply good policy and morality. Even if we believe, and I'll talk in a minute about why I don't think this is the case, that differential rates of offending account for all the disparities we're going to talk about, and the statistics belie that conclusion, we as a community cannot be said to fare well or fare as well as we possibly can if entire segments of our community, entire populations are faring so much worse in so many measures. So let's turn then to incarceration. So, the good news in Minnesota is that we don't incarcerate as often or at rates as high as other states. We do have some of the lowest incarceration rates in the country, and I think this spells it out. Louisiana is really doing its own thing. It is way out there, but a number of other states are giving it some good company. But our racial disparities, let me do one slide first, but our prison population in Minnesota is growing. And Professor Fraze may want to say more about this later, but during an era when crime rates were by and large dropping across the country, our prison population in Minnesota continued to swell. And I apologize, I managed to cut off the graphics that actually gave citations to this, and I'll put them on before we put the slides up. But this is the Prison Policy Institute statistics. So back to looking a little bit about our data, looking a little bit at our data, if I can pull this up. Well, that's not good news, is it? Sorry, guys. Do we just not have internet in here? Okay. Can I have just 1 second? Sorry, everyone. So I think I may have frozen it or done something bad. Okay. So I can keep talking for a minute as we pull it up. I just wanted to explore that link because it's an interactive map that shows where we stand relative to the rest of the country and all these different measures. Oh.
Do you know where it is on the site?
I think so. Okay. Okay, except it's not moving up and down. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay. Sorry, guys, this worked a lot better on my Mac. I'm really sorry. What I'm trying to find is Minnesota, and it gives us a lot of really good stuff, except it's not letting me do that. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So our total corrections population in Minnesota, this is sort of an update on a lot of the statistics that Professor Fraze gave you just a minute ago. But we have a significant measure of disparities in imprisonment. But what I think is most telling about some of these statistics, if I can get them up here, is that we, among all the states in this country, and I showed you Louisiana, I showed you Florida, Texas, and all these other southern states that are doing an awful lot to lock people up, but we are fourth worst in the country when it comes to racial disparities for both. So this is overall where we go with our state imprisonment rate. So we're sort of in the middle overall. Here we have Louisiana at the top, some of the southern states you might expect, and then close to the bottom is Minnesota. So we're doing fairly well relative to other states' overall population. But let's look when it comes to other measures, if I can get it. There we go. Okay. New Jersey, Wisconsin, Iowa, and then us. And again, why is this? And here's some other rates. Felony disenfranchisement. So this, I'll put the link to this website up, and it's got some really good statistics. We're somewhere in the middle for disenfranchisement. So in a number of different measures, I'll go back to my PowerPoint and leave that alone. We are faring worse than other states in the country, yet are nominally progressive. Okay. And our population over time has just gotten more and more, the disparities have increased over time, and I think this is fairly self-explanatory. But for African Americans and Native Americans in particular, the rates have been swelling and are continuing to swell. Many of you are probably familiar with the study that came out in 2015. And Professor Fraze is right when he says that the study that he did several years ago is one of, if not the most comprehensive study of racial disparities in the Minnesota criminal justice system. We, I think, suffer from a dearth of data, and we certainly suffer from a dearth of updated data. But we do have a recent study by the ACLU, a study of 96,000 arrests made by Minnesota police officers for low-level offenses between 2012 and 2014. And the conclusions that they drew were that African Americans were 8.7 times more likely to be arrested for a low-level offense than their white counterparts. Native Americans were 8.6 times more likely. Why does this matter? We're talking about low-level offenses. Why is this so critical? Well, in arrest, and I think I don't know how to emphasize this more than simply to say, you know, for those of us who haven't been arrested, I don't think we begin to fathom what a restriction on liberty means. And an arrest is statistically significant in that it is predictive of the accumulated disadvantage that happens when someone enters the system. But it is a critical psychological intrusion on someone's personal dignity. And for those of us that don't walk down the street in fear of being arrested randomly, I think we don't fully understand what that means. Why are these statistics what they are? Well, the ACLU suggests that an amalgam of different things, but policing decisions, where to police, when to arrest, what time of day, and who to arrest, and whether to arrest at all. These are low-level offenses. Driving after revocation, no proof of insurance, driving after suspension. Are these arrests, and this is a policy question, are these offenses for which we should be arresting individuals at all? And that's a question we have to ask. Last, and I'll end with this, and we'll talk more, a Metro Transit study that came out in December 2015 as well. African American adults are 16% more likely than whites to be issued a citation, 40% more likely to be arrested than whites. Native American adults on Metro Transit suffer even a greater disadvantage. What accounts for these disparities? Professor Fraze began to touch on it. The disparate impact of neutral policies. Again, the internal decision in a police department or otherwise to allocate officers to a particular geographical region of the country. The internal decision to arrest for a revoked license. The decision of an individual officer not to send a kid home and instead send a kid to juvenile detention. These are all nominally race neutral when you look at them on their face, but they have an extraordinarily significant disparate racial impact. And I'll say one last thing about racial bias, and then I'll end. And I'm hoping we can talk about solutions because there are things afoot. There are not studies out there today that readily document overt racial bias. Whether it's that folks who've gotten a little bit better at covering themselves, or simply just don't say what they actually think. Those studies aren't there. But there is study after study out there documenting significant implicit racial bias when it comes to decision making. And not just everyday decision making, but decision making by critical stakeholders in the criminal justice system. Documenting differential times to pull a trigger in electronic gaming when police officers are presented with an African American subject versus a white subject. There are studies documenting implicit racial bias among prosecutors, among defense attorneys, among judges. So to suggest today that we're talking about a problem of differential offending, and this ties back to what I originally said about social disadvantage. Social disadvantage is there, and it's critical, and it exacerbates all of this. But that is not where the inquiry should end. We know that something happens when individuals get into the system. There is an accumulated disadvantage that cannot be attributed to differential offending alone. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are system stakeholders and actors, even defense attorneys, to think carefully, but also to really push to implement policies, and there are a lot of debiasing protocols out there that will all help us be better decision makers. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry about the interactive mess in the middle there, but hopefully we can talk more about some of these issues. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Myron Orfield, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of segregation and disadvantage in neighborhoods. And I think one of the things that always strikes me, my research is a lot about housing and school issues and segregation, spatial inequality. A lot of the maps that show racial segregation are also the maps that show incarceration and kids going to prison and dropouts and poor health and all sorts of things. There's a lot of cumulative disadvantage that exists in very segregated neighborhoods. The Twin Cities for a long time was a place of very low segregation. We didn't have a single racially segregated elementary school until 1991. Last year we have 113 elementary schools that are more than 90% non-white and poor. Compare this to our racial counterparts in Portland, Oregon, that have the same racial mix and social mix. Portland, Oregon has 2 schools like that compared to our 113. Seattle, Washington, which is more racially diverse than we are and has a similar poverty rate, Seattle has 25, and it's 1.5 million more people. The likelihood that poor blacks and Latinos will live in overwhelmingly poor neighborhoods is 4 times as high in the Twin Cities as our racial counterparts in Portland, Oregon and Seattle, Washington. And as I'm going to show you, these neighborhoods predict a lot of very serious problems that people carry throughout their lives. One of the things that I would like to mesh the research that I do better and more closely with the Robina Center. My research often ends when people drop out of high school. And I see that there are neighborhoods in Minneapolis, right in this neighborhood, Roosevelt High School is a dropout factory. Most of the young men drop out. And one of the things that we see is a lot of these young men from Roosevelt High School end up in the criminal justice system. On the other side of Minneapolis, at Southwest High School, that's racially integrated, about 40% non-white, there's very few kids that end up in the criminal justice system of any race. We have schools in Southwest Minneapolis that are some of the best in the whole country, in the whole state. Sometimes Lake Harriet School, which is a 90-some% white school in South Minneapolis, has the highest test scores of any school in the state. 2 or 3 miles away, we have the lowest test scores of any schools in the state, in the same system with the same administration. We have very rigid racial segregation, and I think it contributes to these inequalities. I don't know how as much as my colleagues do about the growth in inequalities, but I know that in studying the Minneapolis school desegregation case, Booker versus Minneapolis Special School District, every year that that school district was under court order, racial disparities in achievement diminished. Every year that that school was under court order, there were more kids, African American, going to college. When that court order ended, the world looked a lot better. There were racial disparities, but it's tremendously different than it looks now. The depth of inequality, the depth of racial disparity is magnitudes higher than it was before. The magnitude of disadvantage has really changed. This is a map that shows the elementary schools in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, and I'm looking at the core. And you can see the red schools are from between 83 and 100% non-white. The orange schools are 61 to 83. The light orange are 37 to 61. The light blue that you can't see very well is 21 to 37, and then the dark blue is 0 to 12. And you can see a lot of schools, where Portland has 2 of these elementary schools in the red range, but we have quite a few more in just the central cities in the first-ring suburbs, 70. This is a map that shows the percentage of eligible students for free and reduced cost lunch, and it is the same map. Racial discrimination creates segregation. If you are black and poor or Latino and poor in this region or in the United States, 3/4 of poor black and Latino kids go to schools that are overwhelmingly poor, that are more than 75% poor children. If you're white and poor, 3/4 of poor white children go to schools in this metropolitan area in the country in schools that are less than 50% free and reduced lunch. There's no dispute in the social science literature that concentrated poverty dramatically diminishes graduation rate. No one disputes that. There's no dispute on that point. There's no dispute on the point that concentrated poverty reduces the possibility that kids will go to college. No one disputes that. No social scientists do. There's no dispute that concentrated poverty reduces the likelihood of middle-income wages and benefits. No one disputes that fact. People dispute the effects of social and racial integration on test scores and many other things, but those 3 things no one disputes. The last time this issue came before the Supreme Court and parents involved, almost 5,000 tenured professors signed onto briefs about these effects of segregation. Only 4 professors disputed these effects, and these professors were very qualified in their disputation. They said that they thought that perhaps racial integration didn't create any big benefits, but certainly social integration does. That was the dissenting view. In Minneapolis and St. Paul and most of the country, in the Northeast and Midwest, racial segregation is social segregation. There is no difference in these statistics. These schools are the same. This is a map that shows disciplinary incidents in students, and obviously the more poor the district, the higher the disciplinary rate. The poorer the school, the higher the disciplinary rate. The charter schools have a much higher disciplinary rate than the public schools do. As you concentrate kids, you have more and more intense discipline, people trying to deal with these issues. And these have all sorts of collateral consequences. Here's a map that shows the dropout rate, and the higher the percentage of poor kids, the higher the dropout rate. And Robert Balfons at the University of Rochester calls segregated public high schools dropout factories. He's written a book about this. There's a powerful correlation to this. What happens to a child in the modern United States when they drop out of high school in a segregated neighborhood where they don't know anyone that has a strong employment opportunity, they've never met anyone? When kids go to college, they're rated not only on their test scores and their grades, but the rigor of their high school. That's almost as important in college admission as the test scores and the grades are. certain high schools just don't have any credibility with colleges. There's nobody that ends up in college in these places. Other high schools, even if the schools aren't very generous and even if they're not very helpful to kids of color, the reputation of the school often gives them an entree to the world that kids in poor neighborhoods just don't have. White people, I think a lot of us believe that we've pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, that we've made our own way in the world, but we've benefited by a huge network of social connections in our schools and our parents. The most powerful predictor of a person's success in life is who their parents are. It's overwhelmingly predictive of their economic and educational success. The second most powerful predictor is who their peers are. And what their neighborhoods are like and who they have connections with and how they find those pathways. And integrated in affluent neighborhoods, kids, if they don't have those benefits in their own families, which is the most important, they can find the pathways and the movements into the college and beyond. In poor neighborhoods, there's often no guidance or no connection, and there's no help. This is a map that shows the 4-year graduation rate, and again, the highest poverty schools are just overwhelmingly dropping out. Health. If you want to take a look at age-adjusted asthma hospitalization, these are the segregated neighborhoods. Why is asthma so bad in segregated neighborhoods? Well, every bad environmental thing goes in segregated neighborhoods because they have no political power. Why do kids get asthma in segregated neighborhoods? Because the neighborhoods are dangerous, and their mothers, and if their mothers are watchful and caring of them, they don't want them to go outside because the neighborhoods are dangerous. Why do kids have asthma in bad neighborhoods? Because there's not good grocery stores in those neighborhoods. There's not good health care services. This is one of the terrible things that builds up. It's one of the cumulative effects of segregation. This is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease hospitalizations. Again, if you want to find the highest number, you look at the most segregated tract. And now we have some experience in the Twin Cities. We built 11,000 units of affordable housing in predominantly white areas. And we don't have these kinds of statistics in those areas. We have higher test scores. We have higher graduation rates. We don't see these kinds of problems. But we don't do that anymore. We've decided that's not a good public policy. Crime. You can see, again, crime in these poor neighborhoods overwhelmingly correlated with segregation. There's a recent article, Robert Sampson's research in Chicago. Why is the murder rate so tremendously high in Chicago and the segregated neighborhoods of Detroit and the segregated neighborhoods of New Orleans? This is about discrimination. Segregation is like slavery. It is a confinement of people to an area without opportunity. It's a hopelessness. It's a condition like this. And the tighter we draw this loop around people, the more tremendous disadvantage. Some of the tremendous immorality about this is the violence that it unleashes doesn't unleash it against the perpetrators of this crime, but it unleashes against the victims of these crimes. The people that are trapped behind in these neighborhoods are subjected to the conditions that are created for them by the outside world. And this is certainly happening in the poorest neighborhoods of the Twin Cities. And felons, again, where do people come from? Where's their last address? In the poorest neighborhoods. Where's their first address when they come back from prison? The poorest neighborhoods, the poorest schools, the poorest opportunity. Do we wonder why we have these disparities? Subsidized housing. This is a particularly tragic statistic. In the Twin Cities, we once built 70% of our subsidized housing in the whitest part of suburbia. In the last 10 years, we've built 8%. We built almost 5,000 units in the poorest neighborhoods at great expense. And we somehow believe that over and over, continuing to concentrate poverty is going to change these statistics. You can see this is a map of subsidized housing highly concentrated in those neighborhoods. This is a map of Minneapolis, and you can take a look at the racial composition. Look at how concentrated this is. Minneapolis was sued in the 1960s for building 68% of these units in segregated neighborhoods. Last 5 or 6 years, they built about 85%. Recent case before the Supreme Court, Texas versus Inclusive Community Projects, almost identical pattern of segregation was found to be a disparate impact violation of the Fair Housing Act. But I think this is one of the things we need to talk about. I think we have to think about our society, whether we're going to live together and share neighborhoods and services, whether we're going to share institutions and networks of opportunity, or whether we're going to emerge into a society where Southwest Minneapolis is white and affluent, North Minneapolis is black and poor, South Minneapolis is poor and Latino. 3 different worlds, 3 different futures, 3 different sets of opportunities. I think criminal justice system is just one of the pieces of it, but think of all the other pieces of health, of the politics of our country. You can see how these trends affect the politics of our country. So I think that in the end of the day, it's important, I think, to connect up the work that we do with the work that Robina is doing, to think about what are all the consequences of creating such a deeply segregated society, and what might be the benefits if we can move toward, like we have in the past, a less segregated society.
Good afternoon. I think one of the benefits of going last today and being able to follow good doctors is that they've laid out all of the statistics. They've laid out all of the reasons that we need to take a look at racial disparities and maybe even change the narrative of equality, of quality of life in our community. My name is Kedar Hickman. I am the program manager of Ujama Place in St. Paul, and I think when you have all of the statistics that come before you, is you get a chance to put a face, put a life in place of numbers and in place of data. I am the great-grandson, grandson, and son of Frank and Minnie Pennick, Andrew and Sarah Parks, Arthur and Jean Frazier, Thomas and Lillian Hickman, Robert and Patricia Hickman. I am the brother to 6 siblings. I am an uncle to 6 young people. I am the proud father of Adia Ninti Iman Hickman, who is my sidekick. I'm a 5th generation Minnesotan, proud to say that. I'm educated. I'm relatively physically, spiritually, emotionally healthy. I'm a homeowner. I'm a taxpayer. I'm an engaged community member. And I'm pretty skilled technologically and artistically. I've been a classroom educator, teaching primary school through adult education. I've worked in community and economic development. I am an asset. Okay? I am an asset. I am a black man. I am an asset. And maybe the question is why do I start by spelling out those things? Is because many of the young men that I work with and that I work for and that I serve proudly is that they do not see themselves as an asset. When we speak to implicit bias, whether it is conscious or unconscious, is because we have had messages for many a decades in our American society that secretly or unconsciously seeks a reality of a bound black man. That secretly or unconsciously seeks the reality of a bound black man. That is unfortunate. So therefore, I want to do a roll call, an Ujama Place roll call. DeVale, a young man who came up in the foster system. He's a young man who literally, his family grew up right around the corner from me. Grew up in foster care, was abandoned by, had several foster care families. There was drug addiction, not in his particular past, but drug addiction in both his foster care family and his natural born family. There was incest. There was trauma. There was what we call poverty in his lifetime, which made him a very angry young man. He came to us very angry, literally had a black eye and had been fighting, and came to us in a huff, ready to snap, so to speak. He didn't like me sharing that in his recommendation to the University of Minnesota, but I said, we need effect. We need effect. DeVale came to us again angry and not having had a chance to heal, not having had a chance to have a stillness and an environment in which he could be himself, his authentic self, to be able to explore his dreams and his hopes, because he was busy trying to figure out where he was going to rest his head that particular evening. Fast forward, because I want to get through this roll call. DeVale, through his work with Ujamaa Place, had access to a caring community, an individual who helped him to goal set, a community that helped him connect to a faith community, an environment that helped him to explore skills that could make him employable. And through one of our partnerships with Goodwill Easter Seals, DeVale was able to take an IQ test and found out that he is a certified genius who has an IQ of 147. By engaging his training in roofing, in the trades, in the labor trades, is he figured out, you know what, this really isn't for me. It is income coming in, but I am not fulfilled. I could do this and I could make good money for the rest of my life, but it is not what sustains me. DeVale enrolled in school at MCTC and found out very quickly, after taking his chemistry, physics, law, advanced math, the name of the class escapes me right now, and getting A's in all of them while working, he figured out he needed to be challenged, and he enrolled in the University of Minnesota halfway through his studies at MCTC. He was accepted. He needs to be invested in to become a future faculty member of this great university. Why? Because he's brilliant, and because he had an opportunity to have a place and space that believed in the power of who he was. Had he had contact with the criminal justice system? Yes. Misdemeanor level, but it might as well have been murder, because it was held against him at every turn. And without a place and a space in advocacy, not just through Ujamaa Place, but primarily through Ujamaa Place, but by its network of partners, we were able to help advocate for this young man. Roll call. Calvin, formerly heavily gang affiliated, rap sheet as long as his arm, had a chance to come to Ujamaa Place, become himself, a place of stillness, a place to connect with other men who had made conscious decisions to make changes in their lives. Brought his family to our housing. Became employed by the city of St. Paul. Success. He was the first man to volunteer for our community garden. And he was a constant gardener. Roll call. Richard came to us from Chicago, felony background. Only person here was his mother, looking to gain traction. Had no connection. found a community that believed in him and did not see him as a felon, saw him as Richard. Entered St. Paul College, graduated early, works in a community church because he sees that as necessary for his growth and his development. Roll call. Zion, young man who came to us from Seattle, disconnected from family, in need of family, in need of support, in need of housing. Brilliant young man. Had already started in school, but unfortunately, like so many, got the first financial aid check and then checked out. Needed to remake himself. Through housing that we have available, Zion was able to bring his family together and have access to some of the therapeutic services that we have, so that he and his significant other could work on building their relationship. And instead of joining the ranks of those who suffer domestic abuse and domestic violence, we're able to develop the techniques for family victories. I could go on, but I do want to get into some of the work that we do at Ujamaa Place. They found this place. They found this network. They found caring and committed people who were willing to work with who they are, that did not ask them to be a felon, did not ask them how long was their rap sheet, although we do ask, but not because we are seeking to call them felons, but so we can help them learn how to chart their future. So we could help them with the understanding that your past, you have to be accountable and responsible for your past, but you should never let it define and limit your future. Let it inform it, not and erase the barriers. So who are we at Ujamaa Place? And I don't have a whole lot of time left. And I think for me, I had this long presentation, but I'm going to take a page out of Ujamaa Place and turn this into a power hour, where presentations turn into conversations. So I hope as the doctors and I get a chance to sit and converse, is that we get a chance to sit and converse, not just for the question and answer period, but when we get outside in the corridor also. In preparation, I was a little bit anxious until I got into the office. And my men helped me to understand that for me to best represent them is that we turn this into a conversation, that we reframe the thinking. When we talk about criminal justice, what are we really saying? We are really, instead of trying to end criminal justice, we are really looking at reestablishing pathways to a higher quality of life. This is what our work is. Because when we see it from that dynamic, we are seeing the possibilities of people. We are bringing people together from education in the academy, from jurisdictions, from the business sector, from the service and what I like to call the quality of life community, for which Ujamaa Place is a part of that. And talk about how do we, in effect, work together. We need law students from the University of Minnesota to help our men navigate family court. We need law students from the University of Minnesota and the surrounding academic institutions to better serve our men who do cop pleas because they are frightened, because they have been stopped because they were a black man and they were in the wrong place. at the wrong time. We need employers to understand the socioeconomic dynamics of what is happening with people of color, communities of color, of a certain economic disadvantage. I'll use that word, because I typically don't call people poor, because that is a judgment on who they are as a human being. But they have been economically compromised and socially compromised. So that is work that we need to do. And I haven't even come close to getting into my presentation, so I'll go back to my roll call because it's important. Robert, who does not have a criminal background but spent 25 years as a pressman for the St. Paul Pioneer Press and lost his job. Well, took an early retirement when the paper was sold. Joined a construction trade program that helped him get back on the horse at Ujamaa Place and got into the field that he ultimately really wanted to be in, and that is healthcare. So he's becoming a nurse. And I know I've got to stop, but it's been spelled out. It's been stated we have a lot of work to do. This is not about simply breaking down disparities. It is about reestablishing past pathways to a higher quality of life. We're all responsible. Thank you.
Okay, our panelists will join me on stage now. We have about 50 minutes left. I'm going to kick off this part of the session with a question, and I'd like to encourage our panelists to ask each other questions. After a few minutes of the panelists engaging in conversation on this issue, we'll open it up to questions from you all. We'll have two of our Robina researchers, Jason and Alexis, will have handheld mics, and so just if you have a question, I'll clearly announce the question time when it begins, and raise your hand high, and they'll bring you a microphone. At 5 o'clock, we'll conclude, but for those of you who are here with us, we do have a reception. We're providing food and beverages, and we really hope that you'll carry on the conversation, come out and enjoy some refreshments with us, and talk to each other, talk to our panelists, and keep the conversation going. So I'll kick this off by, I guess, Richard, we can start with you and work our way. I'd like for each of you to take a shot at the question, which is, what is one thing that we could do now to address the problem of racial disparities, ultimately in the criminal justice system, I guess, but maybe even in some of these earlier stages. And this could be something that you work on, that you see every day, or a promising area ripe for reform that you're familiar with. Just one thing. Well, we'll let you get by with 2 or 3 things, I guess, if you really have.
Well, I guess I may be arguing the question a little bit, but it seems like a really common theme is to recognize the ways in which criminal justice processing makes people worse off. And therefore, not only that's a bad thing in and of itself, but if our goal, we tend to think that, well, you prosecute and convict and punish people, and then they get rehabilitated, and so they don't offend again. But given, and the last presentation just underscored the way in which even a misdemeanor conviction interferes with finding a pathway to a better life for people who were really disadvantaged, and their families and communities disadvantaged before they even entered the system. And if we just sort of treat it as an assembly line, in which each actor sort of attaches their widget and sends it on without thinking about the big picture. All we're doing is replicating and repeating that cycle. So it's not really, it's not a particular reform proposal, although it ties into a focus on the ways in which our decision criteria not only have a disparate impact, but replicate and perpetuate disadvantage. Since I once again come back to the problem of criminal history, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We tend to assume, but without any research specifically on it, that if you enhance penalties based on a person's prior record, you're picking the people who are most likely to reoffend. Well, none of those formulas has really been adequately tested, as you know. So I guess if I have to pick one thing, I would say to try to recognize the impact and the perpetuating disadvantage effects of just that one factor, which isn't just a sentencing factor. It's a decision about pretrial detention, decision about how to charge and plea bargain the case. It's after sentencing. It can be a factor in whether a person gets revoked to prison or whether they get another chance with better, more supervision. So we tend to apply something as simple as the prior record factor blindly, as if, well, of course that's relevant, and of course that's an aggravating factor, and therefore, the formula is what it is. That's the result, and I think we see the result, which is substantial disparities and substantial replication and worsening of disadvantage.
I don't know if it's the most important thing, but reallocate resources. In an era when crime rates have dropped steadily, and yes, they are beginning to rise again a bit, but they've dropped steadily since the mid to late 90s, that we are talking about investing in a new prison in this state at the legislature this year is just remarkable to me. Two. Someone said two. Oh, the juvenile. That's right. That's right. Reallocate resources to alternatives to incarceration and detention, to community supervision. I mean, we know it works. We know that when we use objective criteria to assess risk, we lock up fewer people. And if we were to invest in, if we as a community have to agree that someone needs to be supervised in some capacity, why do we have to lock them up? And why are we not investing those resources to alternatives that are proven to reduce recidivism and are proven to give people a better life path? To go back to what Kadar said, it is humanizing. Supervision's not humanizing anyway, but it is certainly a lot more humanizing to be supervised at home than it is to be locked up or detained for a low-level offense. So reallocate resources.
If I could jump in, when we think of making an investment, we make investments because we want an elevated return on that investment. Which means that if we are investing in prisons, then we are investing in a failed education system. Which means we are investing in lower rates of home ownership for certain groups, for lack of health services for certain groups. It goes back to some of those stats that we have out there. There's a reason why there's a corner store and not a grocery store in some of these communities, because it is an investment in failure. These are the folks who are more likely to end up in that prison that a corporation has sought to run. So where is our investment? Where can our investment go? Yes, alternative sanctioning. That is a part of what our work at Ujamaa Place, because not only are we a social service agency, but we are also a policy agency also. We have to be. Yeah. We have to advocate for the men that we serve. We have to seek out practices first. Practices that happen on the ground level that says that a probation officer can look for some alternative sanctioning for his or her client, like in Ujamaa Place, that sets up a path away from incarceration. One of our major outcomes and our biggest return on investment is eliminating contact with the criminal justice system. It has to be that way. Now, some of our guys are on probation and parole for many, many years, but that doesn't mean that you don't structure your life in a way that there will be a last day and never look back. But for that to be a reality for our men, then we have to talk to judges. We have to talk to prosecutors. We have to talk to public defenders. We have to talk to mental health agencies. We have to talk to housing agencies. We have to speak to employers to help change some of the mindset and the thinking that because you committed an offense 7, 8, 9 years ago, last week, depending on the level of it, that somehow you cannot be a productive and a positive asset and contributor to a community.
I think all the things that we've talked about on the panel are important things. I also think that we have to deal with the fundamental racism and segregation of our society. Part of this is when we create larger and larger segregated neighborhoods, we're not doing this because people are choosing this. This is not the choice that people are making. No one wants this. It's a serious act of discrimination. I look at Richard's statistics and I see the variation that he finds. In my statistics, the variation is huge. A black family that earns $157,000 a year is less likely to qualify for a prime loan than a white family that earns $40,000 a year. We disproportionately build affordable housing in poor neighborhoods. Racial steering by real estate agents is rampant and perhaps is increasing, according to the Urban Institute. School districts very frequently gerrymander school boundaries to intensify segregation. There's no problem finding discrimination in my world. One of the problems is finding somebody that'll do something about it or a government agency that wants to take it on. But part of that creates a prison of segregation, and part of the fact that we're living apart creates a polarization in our politics. It creates an us and them in our politics. It creates an opportunity to have separate societies and play people off against each other. I think it's going to be very hard for us to have a deeply segregated society and figure out how to deal with these disparities. I think it's almost fundamentally impossible. So everything that people said, but I think that the way that we're shaping our society in forcing people to live in deeply segregated neighborhoods, not that aren't their choices, and allowing really 3 or 4 separate societies to emerge, it's going to be hard to deal with the growing differences in our population.
I think I have a few more questions that I could ask, but I think I'd like to turn it over to the audience questions. So if you'll look up top, if Jason and Alexis, you guys stand up and wave. These are our microphone specialists for today. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, hold your hand up high. We have the gentleman in red to start with, and one of them will bring a microphone, and you can direct your question to any or all the panelists. Okay, great.
Thank you. My name is John Poupart. I've been involved in the criminal justice system for many years. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I have significant experience both as an administrator, as an inmate, and as a juvenile offender. I'm an American Indian. I operated a halfway house for American Indian offenders in the past. I'm impressed by this panel today, by the information that you're bringing forth to the communities, and I hope you keep on doing it. I'm here to more or less ask the hard question, which I've always done. I've never shied away from that. What I'm going to say is based on experience and my education in my community and academia as well. We have constantly went at the issue of racial disparities even before it became a popular conversation piece. And we've made no significant progress. Our insistence on going at it in a compartmentalized way, law enforcement takes its shot at it, courts takes its shot at it, corrections takes its shot at it, and now we're talking about some economics that have impact, and we're going at it piecemeal by looking at criminal history and its implications. I would love to see the kind of resources that we're putting forth here today to be reaching out into the communities of color so that we can indeed have a honest dialogue about what really works in our communities. We know that data is important, but data doesn't do the job. It just tells us what we're not doing. And we need to involve ourselves in our communities, in the African American community, the American Indian community, who have some of the highest disproportionalities in our penal system, not only in Minnesota, but throughout the country. So I invite you to come out either to Minneapolis, St. Paul, or any of the reservations to have a beginning dialogue about how we can work together collaboratively in achieving some of the things that you're setting out to do here. You're raising awareness about this, but we'd like to see action in our communities. And a couple of us are here today to try and make some connections with other people about how we can work together and perhaps create some partnerships and go forth. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maggie, and I started out my career as a paralegal with the Criminal Defense Practice Group, and quickly decided I didn't like that, so I just finished up my first year of seminary studying to be a minister. And straddling those two different worlds, if you will, I saw a lot of work being done in the legal community, in the religious community, in social work communities, all these different communities that have a voice in racial disparity in the criminal justice system. But what I didn't see was a lot of crossover work being done. And so many different groups have a voice in this, and they just keep going around in circles and repeating everybody and not working together. So how do we bring all these different groups, all these different leaders that have a say in this and really want to make a difference, how do we bring them together to amplify their voices and work together?
I can try that. Just a quick response to that. I mean, I'm going to try to tie that into the first questioner. Uh-oh. Is that better? I mean, I think that's absolutely essential. And I think even more essential than that is for those of us who are, sitting around at our computers, going through statistical roles, and occasionally getting over to the Capitol, to have at the table with us members of affected communities. I mean, and I think what you're saying goes hand in hand. So there's an institute in California called the Burns Institute, and it's named for the former dean of CUNY Law School, City University of New York. Am I just killing everyone's ears right now? Okay. Who died tragically in a car accident in South Africa in the mid-90s. And the Burns Institute has a tried and true method of coming in and helping communities that are really serious about dealing with racial disparities, if that's the word we're going to continue to use, which I think applies, to put together groups of people from all different coalitions and all different sort of elements, and we'll say that the criminal justice system, but educators, religious leaders, et cetera, to come to the table and to work together to go through a 5-step process that enables them to identify the scope of the problem, to isolate decision points if we're looking at the criminal justice system, to develop strategies, and to implement those strategies and to reflect on their work continuously and along the way. It's out there. I mean, there are blueprints that are out there. I mean, they use the term at the Burns Institute, the phrase adoration of the question. I mean, we've been adoring this question for years and years and years. We've had federal legislation in place. We had, state justice acts in place that are supposed to be dealing with these issues. What we haven't had is buy-in across the spectrum from stakeholders who have the political capacity and the expertise to do something about it. And at the table with them, members of impacted communities. I mean, as much as, I'm, a nice white liberal professional who cares deeply about these issues. Do I live these issues every day? I don't. And I can't think of anything more important when we put together our group of folks who are rewriting bills and bringing them to the legislature than to be at the table with people who live it on a daily basis and who are feeling it, to their core the moment they open their eyes in the morning. And I think that is, we are compartmentalized. And that is something we don't do and don't do well. But it's not for lack of strategy or lack of blueprint to do it. We just have to want to do it.
Well, and if I could underscore that, there's this thing that we call potential. We talk to our men all the time. We ask the question, how many of us have been told that we have potential in this room? How many of us have been told that we have potential? Okay, almost all of us, I would think all of us. And that's and usually when we're told that with good intentions, when we say, but potential is static. It doesn't move. So if we have this willingness, we can't, as I say, you can't just talk about it, you got to be about it. And some of this has to do with having a certain level of comfort and breaking with some fears and coming to tables that were not created by certain dynamics. You have to come to the community table if you want to deal with the community issues, and you have to trust that you are not the experts. That if nothing else is that the data that we collect and some of the evaluation of the data helps to serve the argument of the experts. We have to be willing not to be the experts. We have to be role players sometimes. So part of the work that we do, just kind of to speak to two of the comments, is some of the work that we do is at Ujamaa Place is we work on housing, we work on education, we work on career and job development, we work on tenant training, we work on financial literacy, we work in mental, chemical, and emotional wellness. That and I have to give a shout out to my sister up here, Sister Fashaw, who helped us to understand that this is an issue of wellness as much as it is about illness, but working across a spectrum to be able to meet that final outcome of eliminating incarceration, eliminating contact with the penal justice system, was we have to talk about those other quality of life indicators. We have to do it together. We have to take a look at the fact that right now it is an unfortunate reality. It is a reality nonetheless that we are in segregated communities. But until that reality changes, is that we have to take power within our communities. We have to understand the value of us who are in the communities, and then have the boldness to be able to step outside and say that I have the answer I have a solution, a potential piece to the solution, and then demand that people get on the team. Because that's a part of that, the hard statement. And that's just the reality is we cannot afford to live in ivory towers anymore. The foundations are crumbling.
Convinced me that we have a higher rate of incarceration and poverty for African Americans, but I haven't heard why. Are we just more racist, or what is it about it in Minnesota? Why are we like that? Why did it come out that way?
You want to jump in, Richard?
I wish I knew. I mean, if you, there are certain things that if you look nationally at, again, the largest non-white group, African Americans. So, the worst disparities, this relates to some charts that Perry put up. Oddly enough, the worst disparities, both in criminal justice and I believe in socioeconomic disparities, are in the upper Midwest and Northeast states, which you would think, those would be the more enlightened states, but in fact they have some of the worst disparities. And part of that is just if you lock up fewer people, you don't reach as far down into the offender group, and that tends to, if you're a southern state and you lock up lots of people, you end up locking up a lot of whites too. So that makes their incarceration rates higher, but their racial disparities lower. But in terms of socioeconomic, part of it, I guess, is where people live in the upper Midwest, in Minneapolis and the urbanized areas. People of color are more likely to live in higher crime areas with all the disadvantages that Myron was talking about, and in many of the southern states there's still a lot of people who live in lower crime rural areas, so that's going to have an impact. But some people move to the north to get away from disadvantage. They move to Minneapolis, I guess, to get away from bigger city disadvantage. It takes them a while to get organized. They don't have a lot of family support when they first get there. But I don't think anybody really understands why. Not only it's Lake Wobegon if you're white in Minnesota, and if you're African American or Native American, you're not only worse off than the whites, you're worse off than people of that group nationally. And I don't think we know all the reasons for that. Why would we have more segregation here than it seems than we have elsewhere? And it's a big problem, but so where do you begin to address it? But I wish I knew the answer.
Okay, Alexis has a microphone with this lady up here, and then Jason, if this gentleman.
Okay, so I have a two-part question. The first part is for the first four of you, and the second part is for Kedar. What impact has mental health had in incarceration rates, in recovery rates? And Kedar, what % of the men that you see have serious mental illness? The second part of this question is through all of these statistics, why was this not one of them in your presentation today? I'm not pointing the fingers, but I think it's a real important statistic, especially since, at least in Hennepin County, they have a diversionary program for certain people who have a mental illness, and it can be shown that their mental illness played a role or a factor in the crime that they committed, so they can be, diverted to mental health court. So I open it up to you.
Well, maybe I can jump in first just to kind of, because I think, my answer we can get out of the way and we get to the deeper piece is, I would say 85% of the men that we work with at Ujamaa Place are in the spectrum of mental illness, are somewhere within the spectrum of mental illness. And a lot of that has to do with some historical and some cultural trauma. A lot of that mental illness manifests itself in PTSD.
I can. I'm actually a juvenile justice person more often than a criminal justice person. And what I can tell you about statistics in juvenile justice, and I'll expand beyond just mental health and mental illness to developmental challenges, to educational challenges, learning disabilities, diagnoses like ADHD with comorbidities that are across the spectrum. 70%, in most states, on average, 70% of kids in lockup fall into one of those categories. And I think one of the worst things about secure confinement for kids is the dearth of access that they have to therapeutic intervention. So not only are we, criminalizing adolescent behavior, which query whether we should criminalize it if it's nonviolent, which 2/3 of those in secure confinement are in there for nonviolent behavior. But even if we are criminalizing it, we're certainly not treating it as a rehabilitation question, where we're addressing the underlying needs of these kids and providing therapeutic intervention. And it's, within the population of those who are incarcerated for life in prison without parole as juveniles, it's close to 90%. I mean, it's remarkable. And with that comes marked and abject exposure to forms of violence and poverty that are just extraordinary.
One of the things in my world of housing research, there's a professor at Harvard, Roz Chetty, who has been studying a group of families that had a chance to move in response to a series of large lawsuits throughout the country, the Moving to Opportunities program. And these families had a chance to leave very segregated neighborhoods and move to neighborhoods that people wouldn't, I think, consider nice. They were a little less terrible. But one of the findings that he had throughout the country and throughout the research was the improvement in mental health that people had. The mothers, the children, dramatic improvements in all kinds of mental health conditions, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, PTSD, across the board. And it was fairly consistent and rigorous research. And I think that there's very strong correlations between concentrated poverty and segregation in all forms of mental illness and many forms of stress-related illness, heart disease, diabetes. We sort of are talking about two prisons. We're talking about a prison of segregation and then a prison inside of segregation, which is a real prison. And they're just a continuation of the same thing. One is worse. I think prison is worse and turns back to these neighborhoods, but they're kind of alike in that sense. And I think that that's something that we need to realize.
Yeah. I know one thing that we have done a self-assessment and is for our men to be successful is we had to address the mental illness, the emotional wellness, the chemical wellness issues with our guys. For some very practical reasons, as well as the bigger quality of life reasons, is our guys who learn to manage and cope with stress, who learn how to identify some of the issues that they have, make them more likely to keep a job. It helps them to be more likely to hold on to housing. It helps them. It increases their opportunity of education attainment. Those are some very practical things. Those are the things that, unfortunately, many of our men are missing. And we were finding that, we helped him get housing. What happened? He lost it. He got to the job site. What happened? He lost it. Well, anxiety was an issue. Okay. But also self-image was an issue. So, and I'm just going to shift very briefly because I think we have to be careful about. We know that diversity in a community is important, but we have to be careful about seeing segregation as the end-all to be-all, because one thing that it does is it says that living in and around people like yourself is detrimental to your life, and that is just not so.
The gentleman in the blue, and then Alexis, I think we've got a gentleman over here in blue.
So, a lot of people have to go, but I want to say as far as it's not detrimental, right? Living around people who look like you.
It's not.
Right, but it is detrimental to live around people who are all slapped with felonies, right? And it becomes the resources are tighter, violence rises. When the question about are we just racist in Minnesota? Minnesota is the most conservative state claiming to be progressive anywhere, and that's how we have these great disparities. And people really don't like to admit it, but we have. I know. I had a meeting with Representative Rod Hamilton, who was a Republican last week, and there's a lot of liberal people that dislike him because he's so progressive. And I look at, we talk about, there's so much. We talk about so many statistics and how when I look at the Community Corrections Act of 1973, right, and the Department of Corrections, in their implementation, talk about it's detrimental to incarcerate youth, more detrimental than public safety of leaving them out, right? It's not, no threat to public safety. And that's why we came up with programs to serve them into probation in the community, and how we talked about in the 1990s, right, crime went on the rise because we responded to progress by sustaining poverty and coming up with policies to go back to segregation. When St. Anthony Village was the first city to put an ordinance in where a felon can't live in there, right? And it's very easy to get a felony, right? When that got challenged and that challenge didn't work out, all kinds of suburbs adopted it, right? And those are where the police, when you say a Minneapolis police officer, they're not Minneapolis police officers. Those are officers from suburbs who come into police communities in Minneapolis who don't like people of color, who have an incentive to harass people of color, to give them felonies, to keep them from living near them, right? And it's not, we talk about collateral consequences, there's residual consequences, right? It's not just the people, it's the family. And we know about adverse childhood experiences, and we know about an incarcerated family member increases the potential for addiction. So when that person from addiction has a higher rate of going to a prison, it's not rocket science, you know. It's intentionality, it's demonic.
I think one thing, too, to think about segregation, I think no one would say that people can't choose to live in poor neighborhoods that they want to. The question is, are there sufficient choices for people that don't want to? If a black family that earns $157,000 a year is less likely to qualify for a prime loan than a white family that earns $40,000, that means they have a lot less choices about where they can live. If a real estate agent shows black families certain parts of the suburbs and white families other parts of the suburbs, that takes choices away from both groups of people. If we build all the affordable housing in the poorest and most disadvantaged neighborhoods and none in the advantaged neighborhoods, that takes choices away from people. And I think that people, one of the things I think that whites have, we have a lot of choice. We have choices. We don't have the screen of mortgage discrimination or steering. We don't get gerrymandered out of our school districts. We don't get picked one neighborhood. And I think that if everybody can have choices, I think that we're going to have a lot less troubles in the society.
Alexis, this gentleman here, and then this lady in white will be on deck, Jason.
So I had a question about policing. I know there's been a lot of public policy conversation, particularly recently around prisons, around Minnesota Sentencing Guideline Commission reforms, around the drug sentencing reform that ultimately came out of the legislature. And a lot of that's been kind of at the court stage or at the correction stage, including, things around parole and probation revocation, things like that. I don't think there's been as much conversation around sort of policing, particularly policing tactics in the street. So I'd be curious to see what people's on the panel's thoughts were about that. And also, how do we bring sort of policing on the ground into this conversation, and how do we bring those folks into the room? Because I think I see people from DOC here, I see people from the courts here. I honestly don't see cops in this room, and how do we bring those folks in?
I think to tie this into some earlier comments, I think that's an area where we particularly need to have more dialogue between the communities and the police, so that there are more police in in certain neighborhoods. They go where there's more reported crime, or at least where it's easier to find, and they claim they're doing that to protect the people in that community, and to some extent they are. Most crime is committed within a group, but I think there hasn't been enough working together. Policing is not my expertise, but I think we wouldn't be having some of the issues we're repeatedly having of police community relations breaking down over tragic incidents, and the incidents themselves happening, if there were more dialogue between the police and those affected communities. I think we need to have a lot more attention to the front door of the system, because that determines what comes through the system.
I think there's that kind of goes back to this comment over here. As we take a look at major police forces across the country, and they do not reflect, especially in communities of color, that the police force does not reflect the community itself. There used to be a time when, when young people growing up, they wanted to be police officers, but, there's this conflict for those people of color who want to join the police department. Not for everyone, because we do have some level of diversity within police departments. But, there are those who feel conflicted that somehow I have to give up a piece of myself because the color is blue. And that color and that blue color is undergirded by structures that says that if you see a young black male at 8:30 in the evening at dusk and he is meeting up with another black male, then you need to stop them. Okay, that becomes a conflict, because someone who is from a neighborhood can see, may be able to see and identify that there's something completely harmless about that interaction. But it also speaks to who is training the police officers. It also speaks to leadership within police departments that says that we can have conversation, but communities have to be able to be bold enough to say is that we have expectations. Make a commitment to percentages in drops in certain kinds of practices, or the adoption of certain kind of practices within your department that can bring about some changes in these disparities. Now, for us, we have an advantage. The chairman of the board of our directors is a former St. Paul police chief and the Metro Transit police chief. We have the ear of someone who can actually make some critical practice changes within his department. And yet we still have problems. So we do have to have those conversations, yes, but we also, as much as we talk about these disparities and accountability of those who get caught up in criminal justice, is we need to have accountability for those who are out there to enforce the law.
Can I make one quick comment in response to that? And I'm certainly not a policing expert, and there are those at the U who really are and who are deeply embedded in this. But one structural aspect of the U.S. criminal justice system generally that I keep coming back to whenever we have these conversations is that we are the only country in the Western world that elects our judges, prosecutors, and sheriffs. And when I think about why certain discretionary decisions are made on the street, and I think about what an arrest means to an officer and whether that's a form of professional and political capital that is somehow rewarded in this broader context of our politicized criminal justice system, where elections are won and lost on toughness, on arrest numbers, on convictions. I think it's much less clear to me with judges. And it's not to say that popularism is inherently bad, but in other countries with much lower rates of incarceration, with much lower disparities, arguably different demographics,
there is an ethos of pure professional obligation that surrounds a lot of these positions. And I know that from one of our colleagues, Michael Tonry, who studies this in depth. And I keep coming back to that. Are we rewarding, implicit in our system, are we rewarding behaviors and decisions that have this devastating impact on individuals? And maybe so.
Okay, Jason, we have this lady in the white coat, right, and then we'll go across the aisle.
Yeah, I had a question, and I wanted to just kind of report back something I thought about. I've given a CLE on racial disparities in juvenile adjudication about 4 or 5 times here in the Twin Cities. And one of the things that's so interesting is about a third to a half of the CLE is just a discussion about what racial identity is and how do we relate to our own race. And that's one of the things I've seen that everybody has in common, regardless of your race, is you have some sense of racial identity. And I found that was really powerful in the sense of that's the thing that people comment about the most. People said they're really glad they came because we had this discussion, and it's just a discussion amongst the participants about how they think about race and how they think about their own racial identity. And so I just kind of wanted to share that. It doesn't go to the heart of segregation or racism, but it gets the conversation going in a way that I think is pretty powerful. Another thing I want to say, because I have a different profession and I don't do this as a profession, but one of the things I don't want to have downplayed is just the power of changing minds and hearts one person at a time. That each one of us, regardless of whether we do this all day, we have an opportunity in our lives every single day to talk to people about these issues, to just stop and, my dad was chief of police of the town I grew up in, sometimes I just will stop, observe something about a police officer and stop and talk to him about it. And I think that there's because it's like this big change. I went to a school that had this very famous feminist PhD program. And they always talked about the coming revolution, and I'm like, yeah, but what about single mothers and childcare? I think you have to think about these big changes, but I think it's also important just to think about what can you do every single day that you just wake up and it's easy. The one question I had is we didn't get to this last gentleman's idea of what is the one thing he would do, and I would really like to hear about that.
Is there just one thing? Absolutely not. I guess I have to hear, what was the question again?
If you could do one thing to alleviate.
Not been a very well articulated one. Is there one thing that you can point to that you would like to see happen to address the problems of?
Now I go back to where my mind went. There is, with the vast array of things that I would point to, the one piece is how do we attack recidivism? Okay, because it's one thing to commit the initial crime. It is the revocation or the probation or parole violation that kills folks. That is the purpose for the revolving door. I'll point to our outcome is the elimination of contact with the penal justice system, which means learning how to work effectively, proactively, productively, and positively with that parole or that probation officer. You don't have to be buddy-buddy, but there has to be a last day on your probation or your parole. And one of the reasons why I state this is because we have an Ujamaa man who went through some construction trade training, got a very good career building kind of employment. He happened to be on probation. He was given overtime at work and was at work and forgot to call his PO. The sheriffs came to his job and arrested him. Okay? So we have to work on those kinds of things. You know, why are, we have an expectation. We have men who are released and they come home and they are in halfway houses and have to find employment within 60 days and they have to find housing within 60 days. You were just released. How is that going to happen? We just got a ban the box legislation passed. What is the reality of that? And if you don't do that, then there's a violation there and you face returning to incarceration. So, long story short is paying attention to those issues.
Okay. We've hit the 5 o'clock mark, and I know some of you have questions that we couldn't get to, so I hope you will join us out in the atrium to continue the conversation. Thank you all for being here.